Look at last minute things to do with our exam. So Year 10 exam is 90 minutes and that's going to be 90 marks. So one of the things you should be thinking about during the exam is that's 1 minute per mark. So keep an eye on the clock, keep an eye on how many minutes the multiple choice question should take. So you're probably looking at about 20 minutes for the multiple choice, and then you're looking at for another 40 minutes for the short answer, and then half an hour for the extended response at the end. So 20, 40 and 30 minutes, it should take you up to the 90 marks. You get about 15 minutes of reading time, so during that period you should be checking that all pages have their numbers in the correct order, just in case the pages have been incorrectly put in the wrong order or you're missing a page. So you don't want to get to the end of the exam thinking you've done really well, but in actual fact the page was missing. Also, you should be looking through the entire paper and working out if there's any questions that you feel you can do really easily. If that's the case, they might be ones that you want to start with. You should also be looking to see if there's any questions that you don't understand that maybe you're allowed to ask about. So you really can only ask if there's something that is ambiguous in the question, and that is if there's a spelling mistake, if there was a mistake in the way that the picture has been drawn. And then you want to look at your multiple choice. Alright, so you might have 5 minutes left of your reading time. You could actually in that 5 minutes do one or two of the multiple choice in your head. So once you start, the reading time is over and you start the exam, straight away you can get one or two questions done. So that just gives you a little bit of extra time. Alright, let's have a look at some of the questions and some of the types of things I think you should remember. So I'm not going to go through everything, I'm just going to go through some of the aspects. So firstly, geometry. To do with geometry, the two key words that we learnt to start with were complementary and supplementary. And what we did know is that complementary relates to 90 degrees. So it's normally going to be shown as a right angle corner. Now, where that becomes most useful is when you have a right angle corner and you have a line that splits it. If part of that is 30, then you know that the other part has to be 60. They both have to add up to 90. The same thing goes for supplementary. Supplementary adds up to 180 degrees. So any numbers that add up to 180, and they're going to form a straight line. And where that's most useful is that when that straight line is cut in half or cut into two parts, if I know one part, let's say I know that that's 30, then I know that the second part has to be 150. So one clue gives me the answer to the second part. So they are two very important bits. The next bit that we looked at were parallel lines. So if I had two parallel lines, there's only actually two different size corners. So we have 8 corners, but there's only two different sizes. So if I, for example, know that that's 100 degrees, I actually know all 8 corners. What I do know is this one here is vertically opposite the 100. I also know that this position here is exactly the same position as the one at the top, and that's called corresponding. So that's also 100. So vertically opposite, corresponding, and then that last one is called alternate, and that's also 100 degrees. This one here is on a straight line, so therefore that must be 80. This one here must also be 80 because it's vertically opposite the 80. This one must be 80, and so must this last corner. So now I've got all 8 corners. Right, so that's relatively straightforward. You'll need to know those names: vertically opposite, alternate, corresponding. Alright. The other one that is also important is inside two parallel lines. If that is 40, then this number here has to be 140. The reason being, they are called co-interior, and they add up to 180. So that was another clue. The last thing to do with geometry that I just want to go through is, if I have two parallel lines and I have a line that cuts through in different positions, and I might have this one here is 100 and down here is 50. There's a little bit of a trick that we do for this type of question. To find these 4 angles here, I need to do something extra, and what that is I actually put in an extra parallel line and I treat it as two separate questions. So I treat the first two parallel lines now, the one that I put in the original, and I say that that is co-interior, so that's 80. Right. I then know that this corner here, right, so this part here is going to be 100, and I'll work my way around. If that's 50, that position there will be 50, and so on. So if I need to know what that corner there is, right, so if the original question was asking for the entire corner inside here, I would now know that it's 130. Right, so what I do is I add an extra parallel line, and that way I can actually work out a few extra parts to it. Alright, trigonometry. Well, trigonometry was looking at right angle triangles. So when I had a right angle triangle, and we had an angle, we called it theta, we named the three sides. This is opposite theta, so we call it the opposite side. This is beside or adjacent to theta, and this is the longest side, which we call the hypotenuse. And what we had was three functions. Sine equals opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine equals A over hypotenuse. And the tangent equaled opposite over A. And remember, we had a little way of remembering. So, ka, toa. That should be written down on your actual cheat sheet. So when you go to do some questions, you should be always writing down one of those three different functions. If I need to find a side, then I use sine, cosine and tangent. So an example. 30 degrees, let's say that this is 10 and this is x, and I want to find x. I know that I have the opposite and hypotenuse. Opposite and hypotenuse, it's going to be a sine question. And then I start to fill in the bits that I do know. I know that the sine of 30 equals x over 10. Now, if you remember that when the missing number is on the top, it's a multiplication question, and you can straight away go 10 times sine 30. But if you're not too sure, use your calculator. Right? If you're looking for an answer, use solve. So solve, brackets, write down what you have. Sine of 30 equals x over 10. Which letter do you want to find the answer for? I want to find it for x, so comma x. If you put that in your calculator, you'll get the right answer. And it won't matter whether the x is on top or the x is on the bottom. You'll get the correct answer provided you put the number in the right place. Alright, so the next thing that needs to happen then, I'll just pause for a moment. Alright, so hopefully we're back recording, we are. Alright, so the next topic we looked at also was some algebra. And the three things that we looked at with the algebra were expanding, factorising, and solving. Factorising and solving. So with those three things, basically it's the calculator you're going to use. Alright, so let's just have a look at a calculator example. So, calculator page. Whereabouts do I find those three things? They're under the menu. On the menu, I go to algebra. You can see at the top, solve, factor, expand. If I want to expand, I choose expand. Now, the calculator puts a set of brackets in already. They are in addition to any brackets you need to put in. So if I want to expand 2x brackets 3x plus 4, I've got to make sure that I put in some brackets as well. Now, if we have a look at it, in between here, it's going to want a multiplication sign. Alright, the reason why it wants the multiplication sign is it doesn't recognise sometimes when a letter is sitting next to a bracket. So where I had that error message, the problem was I had 2x next to a bracket, I had to put in a little multiplication sign here. Alright, so 2x times 3x plus 4, and there's the expansion. If I was doing factorising, I go to algebra, I go to factorise, and let's say I had x squared plus 4x plus, let's see, 3, and I want to factorise that. It gives me the two sets of brackets, x plus 1 times x plus 3. Alright, now the only time that factorising you may find some problems is when you've got two letters next to each other. Alright, so if I try and factorise, let's say AB plus 2A, alright, it hasn't factorised it. Alright, all it's done is rewrite the question in a different order. If I wrote factorise, so algebra, factor, and this time I'm going to type in as A times B plus 2A, it does factorise it. So what happens is it won't recognise that when A and B is touching, it sees it as one letter, alright, not A times B. So I changed it and I put in A times B, and that's the correct answer where it's factorised. So if you find that your answer is not quite right, then you may need to actually just double check and make sure put in an extra multiplication. And the last one was solve, and you're getting pretty good at using solving. Alright, so to solve it has to have a formula. So let's say it's y equals x, in fact not y equals, it should be something to do with x squared, let's say plus 2x plus 1 has to equal something, so I want a number. Most times it's going to be something like 0. Which letter do I want to find the answer for? I do comma x, and it tells me the answer is that x equals -1. So the only number that makes all of that equal to 0 is x equals -1. Alright, so that's the three main uses of the calculator. And the last thing we did was graphing. Alright, and for graphing we had some formulas that we had to try and find turning points and other interesting things. So there was two types of formulas we used. One was y equals a brackets x minus h squared plus k. That's called the turning point form. Alright, so what that's telling me is that h and k are in fact the turning point. So when you see the formula in that format, alright, and the a is a number outside the bracket and it's normally a number 1, so for most of the questions in the test that will be a 1 and we won't show it, but h and k happen to be the turning point. The other type of format that we see is y equals a x squared plus bx plus c, and that's where a, b and c are numbers. That's our standard sort of quadratic. Alright, and when you see that format you have to do a lot more work. So let's take an example. I'll just do x squared plus let's see, 5x plus 6. Alright, so I want to try and draw that graph. I can't see the turning point straight away because it's not in the format like it is in above. So the technique was, first of all, we want to factorise it. So I'd use my calculator to factorise, and I'd come up with x plus 2, x plus 3. So if I put that into the calculator, factor, all that, that's what the calculator will tell me. I also want to solve. I want to solve for y equals 0. Alright, so if I wanted to, I could have put all of that into the calculator and said x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0, and it'll come up and say x equals -2, x equals -3. What are those 2 points? Well, those 2 points are my x intercepts. So the reason why I'm factorising and solving is that when I go to draw my graph, I'm going to have two spots, -2, -3, that are my x-intercepts. And then the next thing I had to do was to find the turning point. So what I had was my graph, -2 for example, -3. I know the graph goes down through those, so my turning point, if you remember, has to be halfway between those. So my turning point is going to be halfway between, and the easiest way to find halfway between is you add those numbers together and then halve them. So it's -2 plus -3, halve the answer, and you're going to get -2.5. So x equals -2.5 is what we call the axis of symmetry. It's the middle of the graph. Alright, now what we need to find is, I know that somewhere on this line it turns. So my original rule was x plus 2, x plus 3. If I take -2.5 and I place it in there and in there, I'm going to get -1/2 times 1/2 equals -1/4. That's where it turns. So now I have my graph. Now if I want to find this position here, that's called the y-intercept. And that happens when x equals 0. So I've got my rule. I've got it in the factorised form. Leave it as that. Make x equals 0. So that's 2 times 3. That position is going to be 6. So here it's going to be 6. The other way you can tell is the rule was y equals x squared plus 5x plus 6. And if you make that 0, x 0 squared is 0, 5 times 0 is 0, you're still going to get the answer 6. Alright, so that was the main things. So what you should be doing is make sure that your calculator is set correctly. So if I go back to my calculator, you should make sure you're on full charge. Alright, so make sure the battery up here is on full charge. Make sure that your angle is set to degrees. Alright, if you're not too sure how to set the angle to degrees, go back to the home page, go to settings. Alright, we want general settings, and the angle is set to degrees. Alright, all the best.